Hi everyone, welcome to the fifth round of Nudc 2025. I'm Stanley, I'll be the chair in this round. Before we begin, I would like to other judges will introduce themselves as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Aisha and I'm as the panelist.
My name is Errol, paneling. Good luck for the round.
My name is Airflow and I'm as a trainee.
All right, thank you. Under the motion in combating recession, this House believes that developing countries should implement negative interest rate policy to stimulate the economy. Without further ado, I welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Sorry, will I be given a timer? Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that developing countries. I think that's developing countries when we're talking about countries who are very low in resources when compared to other developed nations is the characteristic of developing countries in which that when combating recession is a big crisis, a big economic crisis that needs to be thought clearly and needs to be thought about the way that we're going to combat this recession, right? We as the opponent government, we we believe that these in combating recession, the best option for developing countries should be the implementation of negative interest rates to stimulate the economy, in which I will explain why this is going to be a lot better with this policy and why this is going the kind of deficit that we're talking about is going to be beneficial for the developing countries. Before that, there's two things that I would like to say in my speech today. First of all, is the principle of developing countries, their interest in keeping the recession away, and why, secondly, the deficit from this implementation of negative interest rates is going to be okay, right? Going to my first point then, about the principle of developing countries and what their interests are and how are they going to combat this, right? I think that why is this true? When we're talking about implementation of uh, negative interest rates, we're also talking about this is a way for us to stimulate the economy, right? So, and when we're talking about recession, how will it look like then? I think that in developing countries, it will look like many things: inflation, high demand in certain resources, and high prices for certain resources as well, and for the people to have less purchasing power or even little to no purchasing power at the end, right? What happens then? I think that if we do not stimulate the economy, when the economy is not stimulated, is that people do not have any more purchasing power, right? And what happens is that there's a threat for us, developing countries especially, to lose foreign investors. Why do we say that foreign investors is really important for developing countries then? I think that it is important for developing countries' economy because the investations that coming from foreign investors are the one main the one main thing from these developing countries to get money from, right? To fund their projects, to let's say have certain projects that they have, and for them to fund that, they need foreign investors, right? They're heavily reliant on these foreign investors. I'll take that later. Why is it important then? I think in recession, it's really important for us to analyze how will people act in these developing countries in the times of recession, right? I think what people do is that they will average people will try to keep their spending as less as possible because we're facing a recession where everything is expensive and everything is high cost. So what happens is that an average person in a developing country where they will actually try to save their money as much as possible, and with that their purchasing power is even lower and they're not willing to purchase other things in which that could stimulate the economy, right? Now why do we say that the deficit is okay then? I think that when we're talking about recession, we're also talking about the deficit that's happening, right? I think that the government is already facing their money being lost by this kind of recession, right? Why is this the deficit from implementing negative interest rates happen then? I think that when we're talking about negative interest rates, we're burning out cash, right? When people take loans from banks, central banks, for example, they're going to get more than what they have initially paid, right? So you're essentially burning cash at that point, right? And this kind of deficit, why is it important then? I think that when a deficit happens in a controlled manner, in which is controlled by the government from this negative interest rates, it's going to boost demand. It's going to boost demands of resources and other commodities, and it's going to create more jobs, and it's going to accelerate economy recovery, right?
Point.
Sure, I'll take that.
So, in the context of recessions, where the lenders get all that money from to cover the negative interest rate?
I think that the government already has a pool of government money, for example, from taxes and other things like that, that has already been in the government hands from the very beginning, and they can use that as the method of keeping the deficit in a controlled manner, right? Now, why do we say that the deficit from interest rates is going to be in the best way? I think that when we're implementing negative interest rate, is always going to be in a controlled manner, because this is a step that is very important when facing and combating a recession, right? The government can actually control and manage it better, because we can control the interest rates as needed as from the government, right? Now, why do we say that there's going to be more check and balances as well, right? I think that there's two things that the government from developing countries want. One thing is that they want to get out of a recession if recession happens, right? I think it's very typical for a government to have this kind of interest to make sure that the country is stable from economic recession or economic crisis, right? I think that's something that is really inherent from a government. Second is that I think that when we're talking about developing countries, the government also want to be re-elected soon, right? They want to be re-elected in the next election. So, and when we're talking about developing countries, we're also talking about people who are very, very involved in politics and their choices. As you can see from people from developing nations, they understand more about how these governments are clearly impacting their lives. For example, in Indonesia, you see that Indonesian people are very involved in the government and the government policies, right? Because in developing nations, the people cannot afford to have these to not have this kind of check and balances from themselves, exactly because the government has a lot of power for them, right? So when people are more involved, the government will have more incentive to make sure that this recession will be controlled. And with that said, this implementation of negative interest rates will always be in a controlled manner, in which the government has the high interest to keep that in a manner that can actually help the recession anyways. So with all that said, so proud to propose.
I think for that speech, to open the case on opening opposition, I would like to welcome the leader of opposition. Here.
Check. All right. We'll start in 3, 2, 1. The existence of recession happens because of the irresponsibility of the government through their reckless policy making. The last thing you would need is more irresponsibility to compound the existing recession into more economic depression. A few points of clarification. While OG has set up this debate quite well, I think there are a few things that need to be clarified still. For example, what do this mean? What is negative interest rate truly means? It means that the central bank sets the interest rates into negative. That is, in real world, it is going to manifest when you are going to deposit savings, that your savings is going to be cut by the interest rate, while when you are taking credits, then you are expected to pay more, to pay less for the credit that you have. The goal is to discourage people to save their own money and to encourage the spending. Hence, there is going to be more economic activity. The counterfactual that opening opposition is going to offer is the lower interest rate, but still within the positive, which is the norm within the status quo anyway. Therefore, you still gain interest if you save money, but also you are able to pay less for the credits. Right. Moving on. Why is negative interest rate inherently bad? We have to remember that in the context of recession, you have a stagnating economic activity. The goal of the government should be twofold. Firstly, to increase the economic activity and encourage it, and secondly, to not let it slip even more into an economic depression. However, negative interest rates specifically bad at doing this. Why? Few problems. Firstly, how do banks even survive recession? It is through the savings that is given by the people, right? And they are in a difficult position to begin with, which they have to lower the interest rate to ensure that people will spend and increase the economic activity, but not too much lesser interest rate to the point that it is going to risk bank runs and mass panics. However, these bank runs is exactly what will happen under the government side, because imagine if the news breaking, people would most likely panic knowing that their money, which they own through their own hard work, be taken away by the forces of the bank controlled by God knows who. All they know is that now they have less money within their bank than beforehand. The impact of this is going to be mass panics, where it's going to be bank runs. People are going to be incentivized to withdraw their money en masse. Therefore, most likely, banks cannot cope within this situation, which risk bank collapse in of itself. And this bank collapse is going to spread exactly because the interest rate level is going to be universal. Therefore, there is going to be more panics, more banks collapse, and it's going to spread even more, creating a doom loop within their economy. This is exactly how economic depression in Argentina, in Bangladesh, started to begin with by these bank runs. The comparative that we offer under our side is that insofar as you are still going to tell the people that yes, your interest may be lower, but you are able to still have more money than you own beforehand. You are able to keep the people from panicking, to keep people to save some amount of money to make sure that the banks are still going to survive rather than creating a mass bank runs under the government side. Secondly, there is going to be minimum positives, minimum impact of the negative interest rate, because sure, the credit is cheaper, but it doesn't negate the fact that people who are already reliant on credit still cannot pay their credit because they have less money than before, which is vast majority of people within the developing states to begin with. They most likely are going to be very much impacted by the economic recession. They're probably going to lose their jobs, which makes them unable to pay their credit to begin with. So yeah, sure, you are able to pay you are able to take new credits in cheaper way, but most likely people are not taking it because they don't have any money to begin with. But secondly, the inflation is within the economy, which opening government concedes, is going to create minimum difference anyway if you're making it negative interest rate rather than low positives interest rate. Because the cost of things is still going to be very expensive. Therefore, people would just keep the cash anyway, keeping inside their home, for example, to ensure that they still have the safety net to ensure that if this recession get any worse, they will still keep their money, therefore not increasing economic activity whatsoever, but not in the bank because of the risk of the bank runs. So the weighing is simple. You, under the government side, you are going to expose too much risk for minimum reward, that is through this negative interest rate to begin with. Before I move on, any points from the government bench? All right. So, second point, why it is going to be especially bad for developing states. Look, I know the context put success stories before in Sweden, right? However, it is most likely successful because the cases in Sweden are impacting different actors. In Sweden, the one who are most likely impacted by this policy is the multinational companies. Sweden have Nokia, IKEA, and whatnot. They can survive the shock because of their massive amount of capitals. In developing states, you are dealing with small, medium enterprises. You are dealing directly with the people who are having no safety net because of the minimum protection and minimum funding that these SMEs hold. They do not have safety net. They do not have the capital. This is important because it is the principal responsibility of the state, especially the central bank, to maintain the stability and the confidence in the economy. You are exactly going to fail it insofar as you are failing the many different types of SMEs within your country. But furthermore, people would be impacted severely because of the lack of safety net and the capital. They are most likely going to lose their business. Businesses would go into bankruptcies and whatnot. The comparative under our side is that insofar as there is positive, you still have room for people to survive through savings. This creates a new safety net for the people and creating the stability within the banking system in of itself. The way is that under our side, you have stability and protection. Under their side, you have chaos. Oppose.
All right, I think for that speech, to close the case on opening government, I would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the framing here is simple, which is that we only have to prove to you as OG why it's within these developing countries' best interest to keep the economy afloat and retain the investment, so on and so forth, right? And so far that the threat of mismanagement is long in the future, or at the very least, the impacts for it to manifest is still long in the future, at least after some meaningful benefits have manifested. For example, for you to have more jobs, where in the recession, you probably already lost it in the first place, or at least there is more money circulation, therefore it's going to be less volatile under our side of the house compared to opting into austerity like policies under opposition that is focused on investors when people are begging for government attention that they have been for so long lacking to get it, right? But I think let's answer the POI from opposition, right? Regarding like where the money comes from. I think there are two possible sources, right? I think A is most likely that you're going to tap into government reserves, liquidating non-cash assets, for example, or selling bonds with greater yields, so on and so forth, right? But also, I think there is a second way that is already being implemented, like efficiency, where you reallocate from non-essential sectors and then you like regulate it and then to like redistribute it to the places where you really needs it the most. I'm not going to tell you like Danantara is the best example, for example, but we say that it's similar to that, where like why you won't take away from important sectors or mitigate mismanagement under our side of the house is that A, worldwide precedents have already existed of how this mismanagement has looked like, and people don't like it, right? Therefore, in the future where this is going to happen, there's going to be more supervision and incentive to check and balance, right? But also secondly, I think the incentive to get re-elected still stands under my first speaker, despite the corrupt institutions, exactly, because people are getting more and more aware now. People are getting like not only financially aware, but also like politically aware of what the long-term implications of this would be. So we say that there are enough check and balances to ensure that this is going to work, right? But there are two things I'm going to bring this debate. Firstly, like rebuttals, but secondly, the extension regarding societal perception or expectation towards the government as people of the developing countries, and like why positive interest rates aren't enough, right? I think let's engage with their minimum positives, right? But I think several areas here is that A, by their logic, you won't have jobs to be lost out on anyway because negative interest rates are the most likely deployed when low positive rates aren't enough. When even that is not low enough for normal people, for SMEs to tap into, exactly because their like cash is so low already, right? Therefore, it'll be when it's the only option that is available to the point where they are willing to take out all of these negative sacrifices that OO has characterized to you, right? But also secondly, I think even if there is like a threat of mismanagement, we already told you as to like why it'll be long in the future, and there will always be a buffer time where people are able to get jobs, even though it's not that high paying, for example. But at the very least, for the basic needs, not for you to save, it's still going to exist. For you to bring food onto the table, or like bring your essentials to your house, is still going to exist, right? But also secondly then, let's talk about this responsibility to maintain stability. I think this falls more under our side of the house, where you give out more hope that to people that they're gonna have more purchasing power because exactly they want to take out these loans, right? If they say that their money is going to be taken away, I think it's just a different kind of management anyway, insofar that they will still have more money to spend, right? We say that it's just going to be reallocated and it's going to like take more circles for it to get around, but it's still going to be there in your wallets, right? And it's a lack of incentive to loan anywhere under your side of the house where there is still a low positive rate, because it's already to the point where they are not able to tap into those options, right? But moving on to my extension then, regarding like societal perception or expectation towards the government, I think while there is mass panic that they have characterized to you, I'm going to bring you into the individual level, right? I think it's not just like, oh, panic buying or like a bank run, so on and so forth, right? But I think the panic of like, this is the only option that is available, especially for a lower middle class, like that is dominating the developing countries' demographic. Therefore, the desperation to put food on their table is going to overweigh whatever like their long-term analysis of like losing out money, right? Insofar that it's what they need currently, right? But I think the moment that you do not give out these negative negative interest rates to these people, is that they are still under the notion that the government still only wants them for their money, right? The government still wants them to like be like cash cows, so on and so forth, right? Which I think is such a big issue under like developing countries, insofar that they've already lost faith in the government. Therefore, whatever policy that makes it look like the government is losing out more for the sake of their people is going to be very, very popular, and people are going to want to tap into this. I'll take the POI.
If people are really needing that money, how would they react if all of a sudden their savings be taken away?
I think then by that logic, they can just take out more loans. I think the money is still there, right? It's just that they are more incentivized to take it out with the negative interest rates, right? I think the amount of money is still more or less going to be the same, but they're still going to want to tap more into it exactly because of the negative interest rates, which makes it look like they have a choice in choosing like what kind of monetary decisions that they want to make in the middle of a recession where the sense of hopelessness is already that high, right? But also secondly, why positive interest rates aren't enough? We say that at best the delta is equal insofar that they're being pushed to pull out their money, which is parallel to the increasing purchasing power. Insofar that our burden is only to prove to you why the economy will be stimulated, not on whether it's going to be like back to normal, so on and so forth, right? Insofar that we just combat the recession to get it back to the normal status quo, then this is the necessary action to take on, right? But also, I think B, the reason why it comes into deployment at the very first place is that because with the low positive interest rates, people are unable to tap into that option, right? Meaning that the government has already failed to fulfill that state responsibility to not only give economic stability, which is uncertain, I think, under both sides of the house, but at the very least, we're able to give you that sense of hope that this is something that you can tap into, that we are losing out more under the government side, under like the state, for the sake of the people, right? In which I think it's also possible to happen because government intervention in central banks is also notoriously happening in like majority of developing countries. Therefore, with all those reasons, proud to propose.
I think for that speech to close the case on opening opposition, I would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hello, just checking, is this loud enough? Amazing. Okay. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The existence of negative interest rate is a half-baked policy because it does not incentivize and stimulate the SME or company as much as credit removal, and it discourages people to save, but it does not encourage people to spend as much as positive interest rate or adjusting minimum cash banks in the status quo. So therefore, the strategy that opening oppositions will execute in this debate is very simple. We're going to prove two things. In monetary policy, which is the context that opening government claim, we will win by explaining why positive interest rate bring much more benefit. Or number two, we introduce you to another alternative, which is fiscal policy that works significantly better than negative interest rate to stimulate economy. And with that alone, I think you should cast a ballot already for opening oppositions. Firstly then, let's seal the deal of where the capital actually come from. In recessions, I would say it's a bit unpersuasive for opening government to say that lenders had that significant amount of money to lend because they were being very dismissive on JSON analysis, which is much more important. Because in these situations, you are unlikely to get investment from investor. Because in these situations, investors are likely to be risk averse because they know that the portfolio of the companies or lenders are getting unproductive. Therefore, the best way for companies or lenders to get money are coming from two ways. The first way is coming from the safer that stores the money, but in fact, you probably decrease the significant amount of money with the negative interest rate. So you create massive pull out where banks do not really have significant capital to be invested as a loan model. But second of all, importantly, most of the times banks actually had cash endowment, right? This is a significant amount of money that banks need to store in order for banks to not collapse. Probably, for example, banks like Mandiri, BNI, or anything needs to store for about like 500 millions in order for that banks to not collapse because they also have responsibilities that they need to pay in the short term, i.e. responsibilities to actually pay your workers, pay short-term debts or anything else. If the crisis happen, that entails you need significant fresh amount of money that you need to allocate in these situations, right? For any purpose. It could be boosting government services or companies' productivity. What I'm saying is, if government execute this negative interest rate all alone since the first place, they will not work because there is going to be another monetary mechanism that is much superior, which is introducing and actually boosting fresh cash for that to ensure that you actually have significant capital that you can actually loan to others companies. So therefore, because we understand that banks need significant amount of endowment to fulfill their short-term interests, you force these banks to actually investing more and giving more money to lend and giving more money to the people who want to lend that money, and resulting into banks fail to fulfill their short-term responsibilities. That is to say, now if that happened, then the possibilities of lenders collapse is likely to be higher on their side of the house. Or you need to maintain the significant amount of saving to ensure that banks are not collapsed. So these two things are mutually exclusive, and I think opening government cannot claim this hand in hand. If the chaos happen, if banks fulfill their short-term responsibility, government is going to be the one who needs to take the bill. So government is going to need to spend more money in opening government to ensure that bank didn't really fail that short-term responsibility. To this, government said that, but state will back the people to fund the rest of loans cut. Well, number one, the problem is this debate is not only about monetary crisis, right? Because this is not a situation where you've got too much money or too less money, as what DPM itself considered, as what DPM themselves considered. So therefore, the amount of money circulating in this debate or in this market is generally the same. So therefore, market had enough money. But the problem is because people generally do not want to spend it because of structural problems. And I think there was a chronological error in government bench case. Why? Because the reasons why recessions happen, it's not because companies are being unproductive because they literally do nothing, but companies become unproductive because they were unable to pay debts in most circumstances. This happened in Evergrande cases. This happened in a Wall Street cases where companies fail to fulfill their short-term responsibilities. That's why recessions happen, and this happened in a larger scale. So when companies collapse because of unpaid debts, guess what government side offers? Unilever will be offered by state to say that, guys, I know you already failed to pay your debts, So here we go, more loans for you. That is exactly the government proposal that they executed. That is crazy because no one or like no companies will take that opportunity. So therefore, in opening oppositions, in conditions of fiscal stimulus, we completely support government to remove the debts so that companies will have no financial burden and probably hire more workers, invest in assets so that the money can circulating once more. So where all this money coming from? Exactly as what opening government themselves model. The money are likely to come from cutting non-essential sector that does not directly influence economic, such as education, environment, or anything, so that the money can cover up, so that the economic recessions probably need to be solved by only fiscal stimulus and not monetary stimulus like what happened in opening government. We consider that crisis happened because of mismanagement. But before I'm going into something that's very complex, opening. Yeah, exactly. That's what caused even more problems on your side of the house. Gali lubang tutup lubang. Because now the amounts of money that companies have will not be injected to pay workers' salary. Will not be injected to buy more assets, expanding their business, but rather just to pay debts again, and again. And this is what creates even more miserable failures on their side of the house if that's a policy that they executed. So therefore, if we assume in either side of the house we have money to cover that up, I think we consider that the crisis happened because of mismanagement coming from companies. Evergrande actually messed up really bad by wrongly forecast various capability on the real estate sector. But guess what? The same incompetent management would still exist on their side of the house. Now, they will use that loans given by the states for intangible purposes, such as paying the company debts again and again, without actually indicating or having purposes to invest this to circulate the economy once more, like paying the workers' salary and etc. What does this mean is that, at best, what happened in opening government and closing government is that the companies will constantly trapped in circulated amounts of debts that they need to pay again and again. But at least in our side of the house, the companies do not really need to deal with those stuffs. Why? Because when you are giving the contracts to the companies to remove the debts, it usually come within the certain precautions. It usually come within the certain requirements, such as your companies must have a structural change, such as some leaders need to be taken off, because if this leaders still stay in power, we will not trust your companies. So these are the incentives given exclusively by state to ensure that companies will change on our side of the house. So if this debate is not about monetary policy, because DPM conceded that the amount of money would still be there in either side of the house, then this debate should be way based on fiscal stimulus policy, and only opening oppositions answer why the fiscal policy would be better off in our side of the house. Propose.
I thank for that speech. To open the case in closing government, I would like to welcome the member of government here. Before that, I would like to everything to test the microphone for you to easier in doing POI.
Test.
Okay.
Test. Check. Am I audible? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. To respond to case, they talk about mass panic that is leading to people leading to bankrupt, that they cannot afford this negative rate or whatsoever. I think this is not true, judges. 3 analyses on this. First, I think under economic recession, in developing countries especially, we think people would have the same understanding, right? That they are trying collectively to survive, right? Because I think there is media publication when, all over the country, they're talking about this economy recession that we are trying to survive, right? And second, I think having their money on banks is the prerequisite of them being survived together in this whole of economic recession, right? And second, given that most people in developing countries are those middle to low or low class, from low class, I think these are the people that we want to protect, right, in this debate. Then 2 scenarios under CG case. First, I think if they are mid to low class and still have money in banks, the surviving analysis could work for them, right? They're wanting to survive in this economic recession, and they know that the prerequisite of it is to have your money in the bank, right? Or second, if they are low class, I think they
they don't probably don't have money anyway in banks, so they would just get the benefit for this policy, right? This is what we want to achieve, right? And the third analysis, I think who saves money in highest amount in banks that is can stimulate the economic activity is those that is rich and those oligopoly in the country, right? Why they won't take their money from the bank is because during economic recession, judges, they are experiencing this profit loss due to the people inability to buy their products or inability to consume their services, etc. They know that and they want to get profit because they are really profit oriented, right, judges? So they wouldn't want to take back their money from the banks because they know that if they do that, then the people would not have the ability at all to give them profit, for example, right? Moving to my contribution, then three things I will be talking about today. First, about people reaction towards this policy. Second, about investors, and third, about deficit on government spending and fiscal policy itself. First, about people reaction. This is what OG didn't bring at all, right? I think under economic recession, the prioritization, the picturization of this world, of these countries, are people are struggling in their day-to-day life, right, judges? They are experiencing like lack of job opportunity, for example, a lack of model to start business, for example, or goods or services high price is really high, for example. This leads to people feel hopeless, right, judges? What does this look like? It looks like, A, they're afraid of borrowing money, judges. Even with the low rate, there is still the risk of not being able to pay back the loan to the banks, for example, right? It's worse under economic recession, where first, people know the ability of spending is low since people don't have money, so they don't want to borrow money and start business, for example. And second, they would have to pay back the rates even if the high risk of failure existing, right? So they don't want to borrow money, for example. And B, given that when we apply this policy, we think people wouldn't use the money recklessly that causes inflation, like what OO tell you, right? Because look at what happened after 2008 crisis. I think the interest rate was very low at that time, but due to the same experience that people share during recession, they utilize the money, they utilize the policy that government give to them to empower themselves to survive in a long time, because they know that economic recession is very horrible, right? People create businesses, etc., that is empowering people to have this ability to to start the economic activity and whatever. Second contribution is about investors. I think opposition said that with negative rates suddenly like make investors run away since they don't want to lose their profit, etc. We agree with OG judges that investors are important, especially in developing country during economic recession, right? Why? But why that investor would not like run away from our country because our interest rate is really very low to the negative territory? Two analysis. I think A, the prerogative of investor wanting to put money in your country, in our country, especially developing country, judges, where it is very unstable and low infrastructure and whatsoever. I think it's when it has stable market, right, judges? When there is economic activity happening there for them to make sure that they would have their money back, right, judges? The problem is when these developing countries like experiencing economic recession, where people are not borrowing money and start the economic activity, when people don't have the very ability to start the economic activity, then investor would not want to put their money in the country, right? Because they know that the country is experiencing economic recession, and they wouldn't have they wouldn't have like the profit back, right? And B, I think when we stimulate the market then using this negative rate, that can only be done with low the rates to negative territory. It's more likely for investors to come in because again, they know that they would have the money back, etc. And the third argument is about deficit. I think OO question then, how would we get the money to for this negative rate? And I think opening government already answered that by saying that banks already have enough money, etc. But we think we were going to that even better, right? Because we think under our side, yes, there is deficit. Yes, government will have more spending than the earning itself. But we think that the money that is losing is still out there, right? Meaning that the money that they cannot get in this deficit is still out there. But where the money is it's in like the companies, right? But you cannot take it as is their money, as is like that is the private company's money, etc. The solution is that negative rates force them to put those money in banks to them used by the lenders itself to stimulate the economy itself, and it's forceful enough since they want profit anyway, since they know that that is the only way for them to get profit anyway, so people have the ability to spend or to buy their products anyway. So that is the only way for them to, to give back the money that is in themselves during this deficit, etc. Right? Because we think that government deficit is equals to company surplus, right? Why then fiscal policy is not enough under OO side? I think taxing, for example, is not very effective because I think lobbying exists, right? We think oligopoly power in a developing country, precisely in the economic recession, it is very great to make sure that they want to get most profit, so they wouldn't they most likely to avoid this kind of taxing, for example, and that's why we think the only solution is by implementing this negative rate that can like make sure that people would have the ability to stimulate the economy, etc. That's why proud to be CG. Thank you.
I think for that speech to open the case in closing opposition, I would like to welcome the member of opposition here.
Tes. Oke. I think the context of recession is not as simple as just saying that if we spend a lot of money, suddenly things will become better. Sure, it's a part of it, but I feel like a recession has a lot of multiple variables also at once. Not only that it's a problem that people do not want to spend, but I think it's also a lot of instability in other area. For example, this looks like instability in political climate where there is a lot of protests and demos, for example, or like a problem with corruption, for example, that decreases the confidence coming from investor that does not want that stop businesses from growing, for example. Or this looks like instability in market that is probably something that we cannot predict. This looks like market crashes that is often times caused by externalities. This looks like international problem, conflict, or even restriction, like tariffs or wars, for example, or even like a lot of regulation coming from external actors that also cause a lot of instability that now affects your ability to affect your economy in a bad way. Or second, simply like advancement in like groundbreaking technology, for example, in like AI, or for example, or all of those development stuff is also a part of the process when there is a recession. What I'm trying to say is that to fix a recession, you not only have to get money flowing, but you also have to protect yourself from all of this conflict, all of this risk. For example, I think you can only for example, protect yourself when you have a lot of liquidity that I don't think like OG or CG has, for example. Because for you to combat all of these problems, you need to combat all of this problem through like fiscal or new monetary policy, or even like investment in certain projects to create more output later on in the future, or simply like using this kind of liquidity to have like short-term relief, so you are able to mitigate all of those risks. For example, I think when you are able when you are not able to protect yourself from this instability and you're not stable, for example, your economy is not going to be stimulus either way of other side in both sides of the house. Because for you to go back and having your economic stimulus, you have to, for example, be stable in the first place. I think there's in need of protection of yourself. Only in opposition, you are able to get this liquidity for you to, for example, are able to protect yourself. I think in government, what happens is that you punish these people from depositing the money. This money is supposed to be the liquid asset or illiquid asset that you have to protect yourself from a lot of problems in status quo. So this means in government, you lose the ability to react to this kind of problem exactly because a lot of reaction of this kind of unpredictable problem, and therefore you cannot protect yourself as the country itself, right? As a developing country that has a lot of instability. I'm going to quickly engage OG on this problem because they did try to respond by saying they still have enough money. What did they say? Number one, they say they have a lot of reserve. I would say this is not enough for two things. Number one, it's a developing country. I think we can safely assume if it's that it has like probably if there is a reserve, it's going to be a small amount because they do not have a lot of capital in comparison to a lot of other country. But second, as OG has already said it, you are already burning money as a status quo. So I would say even if you are tapping into your reserve, like like reserve budget, for example, I still don't think it's enough for you to have this to use for policy to protect yourself, for example. But second, they also try to bring about like Danatara exists, for example, or simply like the allocation from things that is non-essential to things that is essential. I think the context of developing country is quite important here because I feel like a lot of developing country already have limited budget. So most of that issue, for example, that they push for is already at the essential part of their area, for example. So if their analysis is true and they get money from like shifting non-essential stuff to essential stuff, I would say it's only a little bit of money because most of their agenda is already on essential stuff. So I don't think that liquidity is quite, is there, right? I feel like the only option that they can have is just borrowing money. And I don't think this is good, right? Because if you borrow money, it's either one, the other country have a lot of influence in your policy making ability, and we probably do not want this because we want a lot of autonomy and because we want to autonomy for our country. But second, you still have to pay money more later on in the future. So I don't think liquidity is good in our side. I think only in our side, in our comparative coming from CO, we are the only team that is able to get the protection of this kind of policy and protection of our own country, for example. I think in our side, the alternative is quite the same. We still want to have like a positive interest rate because I think this is important for business. It's important for banks to be able to fulfill their own short-term responsibility. Why then having this is quite important? Because I think having them to fulfill their own responsibility is the prerequisite for businesses growing, for example. Because I feel like in developing country, I think this is also engaging to CG because I think they talk about like businesses are scared to grow now. I think the demand for making small businesses in developing country is always going to be there because most of the time there's the alternative to have a big businesses is not there, right? Because historically they have been colonized and they do not have the time or effort, time and resources to like compound their to have a big businesses that stay for a long time, for example. So I feel like the demand to make like small businesses is always going to be there, even if it's hard, right? I feel like wait, before that, sure. I don't get what that's important. Wait, I don't get what that's true, right? So because I think in our side, when we want to have like, I think there is always a demand for businesses coming in outside of the house because I still think the demand is going to be there, and I think this will stimulate economy well. We are able to, for example, fulfill our short-term, burden, and therefore banks can function well. This is quite important. But number two, we also have liquidity to protect ourselves. If we are not able to protect ourselves, we probably wouldn't even have the banks wouldn't even function in the first place. I think protection of our country is probably the prerequisite for a lot of the benefit. Proud to oppose.
I think for that speech to close the entire case on closing government, I would like to welcome the government whip. Here.
Check, check. Okay. My POI preferences, you can just raise your hand. So, I'm going to start my speech. Okay. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, I'm going to divide my speech into one part, which is I'm going to responding to all the cases by opposition side of the house. First thing first, let's engage to a certain kind of like things. I'm going to also extend to a certain kind of like things, right? Notice that we're talking about how then the developing country it looks like, right? We think the developing country is basically, of course, they have an unstable economic and also political kind of like views, right? We think that the prerequisite of how then the investor is going to be looks like and trying to engage with you more is you need to have a stable kind of like politics and also economic, right? But then in here, we talk about how then this kind of like assertion looks like, this kind of like motion looks like. It means that there's going to be a hard capabilities to them to proving and also increasing those kind of like liquidity in economic kind of things, right? But then prove to you why this kind of like policies is also going to be hard to be achieving when developing countries exist. First thing first, let's see what is likely to be happen. What is the chances that would be exist? Of course, those kind of like government would likely to change this kind of like price or even those kind of like things in order to just like get engaged to this kind of like policies, right? They would likely to not engage on trying to change those kind of like rates, for example, for those kind of like society that live in that country, exactly because there's going to be things that happening. They know that there's a hard kind of like things such as economic problems, so they would not going to engage with that things. Of course, it's going to create the backlash at the end of the day. But then second, they would likely to change or even trying to make a nice about the policies for those kind of like investor and people that come from another country, exactly because they knows that these things is something that really profitable. They know that the income that most likely is come is of course by those kind of like rates or even the investor that come and pay to them at the end of the day. We think that those kind of like things is also being the prerequisite of how then they're going to increasing those kind of like policies or even etc etc. But I'm going to move to the closing oppositions of how then they're trying to build about argument. We think that we think that we successfully cope with that we provide the incentive from domestic company to give the money to start the policies, right? But they also talking about how then it's going to fulfill the short-term burdens itself. Notice that when economic is happen, these things is happening, it means that there's going to be a less purchasing power for those kind of like peoples, right? There's going to be a lot of people that wondering how can I actually get a lot of money to fulfill my needs. For example, the basic needs such as how that they can eat, for example, is actually going to be something that really hard to be achieved. We think that when we just pursuing for this incentive to just like giving the loans with the less or even negative kind of rates, is going to give them a chances to actually pursuing, and also it's going to be better in our side of the house because at the end of the day they're going to prioritize and also get those kind of like chances to fulfill the short-term needs that they want. But even if that's true, we think that it's not only about short term, but it's also about how in the long term it is the case. Exactly because when they have those kind of like purchasing power, they get the loans by the banks itself. They can just like fulfill and trying to pursuing those kind of like things later. But then second, I'm going to engage with how then they trying to say that, okay, how then the bank is going to survive. Within that there is two mechanisms. It's also going to answer the POI from OO, how then the banks is get the money, for example. I think that yes, it has been explained also about the OG, but I think that most likely government is always have a bunch of money. When this kind of like these things is happening, it doesn't mean that they're going to have no money, right? They still have some money, or we can just like say it as money that they save when there is something that would be happening at the end of the day. For example, like this, to just like providing and keep the money liquidity. So I think that those money that they have as something that they save at the end of the day, they can use it to providing and also give it to the bank to actually bounce back at the end of the day. But then second, I'm going to also responding to how then oppositions is going to say about inflation looks like, right? We think that yeah, they talk about inflation is going to be happen, and at the end of the day, people scared to actually come out from the home because they are scared to using their money, etc., etc. But notice that people is rational to begin with. People notice that when they just stay at homes and doing nothing, for example, because scared of inflation, there's not going to be a money that they got. How then they're going to stay the money, and then the money suddenly come to them, and they can fulfill every single thing that they need, right? We think that is something that needs to be clarified for the very beginning. But second, we think that when we're talking about inflation itself, how then the supply and demand exists? Yes, demand's going to be increased, but we think that supply is also going to be increased and also going to be exist in our side of the house rather than in their side of the house. I'm going to prove to you why. The prerequisite of one country to get back and get the interest when economic recession is happen is you need to get enough capital to fulfill and keep survive. Then how is it going to achievable in our side of the house then? First thing first, negative interest rate. How does it look like? You're going to see this, or even society going to see this as a chances to actually engaging with the things you need and also push yourself to keep in sustainability, as Wyden, my member, has explained, that there's going to be a lot of startup business that trying to keep survive. But then second, notice that when banks do so, there's not going to be a last purchasing power that we have been talking about in here, exactly because the mechanism is not going to be the same. I'm going to prove to you why. It's changing. The monetary circle is going to be even more liquid. Why so? People would take loans and just like increasing their purchasing power. It means that the price that at very beginning so high would slowly going to be stable again, right? It means that there's going to be a purchasing power exactly because they are borrowing the money, and at the end of the day, they're going to just take it. Yes.
Developing country has always have been limited capital in getting their own money. So I don't buy your analysis that suddenly they have money magically.
Yeah, actually developing countries already have a money, but I think with this kind of like things, I think that it's going to be better to actually giving them those kind of like mechanization with the surely kind of like liquidity about their monetary, for example, right? Because at the end of the day, there's going to be our impact is we're going to get a lot of like business that's going to be startup at the end of the day, which I'm going to explain it further in my argument in my extent. Then notice that when we're talking about this. People would take the loan and just like increasing their purchasing power. It's what I said before for the very beginning, that this kind of like purchasing power is because it's really high. At the end of the day, it's going to be lower, right? But then second, the business that still exists would capable to go again. For example, the factory that stopped because less capability to pay over the overhead of the company would be able to go back again because they take the loans from the bank. But then it means that there's going to be chances for them to open the job for the people that need it, right? Yes, there's going to be only gonna be a last kind of like job opportunities, but we think that it's still going to be impacted to all the sector. For example, also about the supply itself, primary needs is going to be better in our side of the house because, for example, petani pay for the fertilization and also they need to pay for the perjalanan to just transfer it. It's going to be even better because they have those capability probably to be, CG.
I thank for that speech to close the entire case on closing opposition. Welcome to the opposition whip here.
Hello, okay. I question CG because I think their case is confusing. They say that people won't borrow money, as their member of government tells you, because of the situation is hard, right? Where people doesn't want to spend their money because recession happened, where like prices of products are rising up. Therefore, they just want like saving their money. But then they said that investor can only exist when there's like activity. So I don't know how then their benefit can run when at the first place people don't want to spend money as like as they characterized it at the first place, right? Because like my member already explained to you that the liquidity on their side isn't there, because like as also my member then question how then suddenly they have money, because country cannot protect themselves at the first place, therefore like recession happened, right? So I don't know how then it can be their benefit can be trickled down, where like as like their whip speaker explained to you that people then can fulfill their like short-term needs, for example, to basically just like to eat today. Then yeah, we question their likelihood closing opposition closing government out of this debate. Moving on to let's compare between opening opposition and closing opposition. We agree with opening opposition when they say that we want low interest rate, but we just don't want it to be minus, right? But what makes CO and opening opposition is different at the first place? Understand that our stance as closing opposition is that we want people to be able to protect themselves. It's important because it gives people agency to what they will do in this like hard time, right? Because they know, because like there's information circulating online on like war stances, for example, Bitcoin prices dropping. They basically know what is going on. Therefore, we giving them agency to like navigate on this like hard times, right? Then we can like push them to like making businesses, for example, or spending their money on like local businesses. Therefore, like activities can happen, right? As opening opposition, they focusing more on the established local companies, because in our side, people can still get credit with low interest rate, right? Therefore, even in hard times like recession, we can push these people to use their money, and therefore it can be good. So how then it can be good? Understanding that banks need to run first so businesses can run. How it can be? Because understanding when this recession happening and we pushing these banks to work, a recession can change, right? Because we still allowing people like to borrowing money from banks. Therefore, people can spend their money, right? Because for example, like job employment still happen. Therefore, people are more like there to like spending their money because they believe they can stay stable even in these hard times. They can still have like safety net, because like the banks isn't like cutting off their savings, right? And also it will like allowing people to like spending money on like products, because there's like cheaper products also circulating in the market. Therefore, people are also more like brave to spend their money because it's sufficient with what they have currently, right? Now moving on to opening government, right? Because when they say that, we say that in opening governments is that you cannot protect yourself as an individual, because at the first place, what you need to do, what you need as an individual in this hard time is that there's a good policy that is catering to you and the capacity from the government to make a good policy. Therefore, because of there's these two variables that is happening that we already push as closing opposition, now you are able to protect problems from externalities, like right, like from, for example, you aren't like supposed, you cannot just like put your money in banks because you know that banks will like cut off your money, right? Therefore, it's like you have like more savings in like other assets, for example. So banks later can just like do what they should do, because people are now already protecting themselves in this hard time, right? Because now moving on to like our response and also like more of my extensions for my member, understanding, but when they say that, other side, it will keep the recession away, because understanding of that inflation is high demand of things, yet people have low purchasing power and start going on. But understand that our response is that will not happen on their side, because people won't borrow money at the first place, because they alone is struggling, as we have characterized to you before, right? People are scared to spending their money because of like this information circulating online about how they are so unsure about the current status quo. Even when it's true that people even when it's true that suddenly it magically happened that investor coming on when like there's this inflation going on, it will still better in our side, because understanding that as closing opposition, we already explained to you how we give more agency to people, where we want like them to like spend money to like businesses, for example, because understanding the characteristic of like these developing countries is that they have like limited money at the first place. Therefore, you need a lot of entity to
Point before 6.
you need to a lot of entity to trickle down the benefits. For example, is this businesses where like they can create jobs for these people. Before 6, yeah, I'll take your PI.
Your entire mechanism lies on that you have enough liquidation because that is the government responsibility. However, there is no money that these people would want to spend if they are not able to lend anything.
Yeah, I don't think that. I don't. When people will still spend their money, but like on their side, people are not pushed to like create like to spend their money productively, right? People are scared to like spend their money because like they know more when they just save their money, the banks will just cut down their money, right? Moving on also on how like businesses are also very visible better in our side is that because there's a lot of information going on how like people can do like businesses, like and also like as like developing countries, people are more pushed to do like SMEs, right? Therefore, like yeah, people are more interested to do like businesses. And also, even though like yeah, businesses is not like the most like more like the most effective or like the most like pragmatic way to like people to do. There's like people that will do businesses are the only one that only take the risk. Therefore, yeah, these people that will do this are the one that already understand and will be able to cater to the problems that with that pros to oppose.
I thank for that speech. So it's the end of the 5th round of Nudc 2025. I thank for everyone for the debate. For everyone in this room, please go out first, waiting for deliberations 15 till 20 minutes. Thank you, everyone.